The year is 1942, and America stands on the precipice of the greatest scientific gamble in human history. In a small office in Berkeley, California, a chain-smoking, theoretical physicist with piercing blue eyes and an almost otherworldly intensity is about to receive a phone call that will change not just his life, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. His name is J. Robert Oppenheimer, and within 3 years, he will orchestrate the creation of the most devastating weapon ever conceived, earning him the title of the father of the atomic bomb and cementing his place as America's most important scientist during World War II. But how did this brilliant yet troubled intellectual, a man who had never managed so much as a laboratory, become the central figure in the most ambitious scientific project ever undertaken? This is the extraordinary story of transformation, genius, and the terrible burden of knowledge. To understand why Oppenheimer became indispensable to America's war effort, we must first journey back to his origins, to the privileged world of early 20th century New York, where a precocious child was already displaying the seeds of the brilliance that would one day split the atom itself. Born on April 22, 1904, Julius Robert Oppenheimer entered a world of comfort and culture. His father, Julius, was a successful textile importer who had emigrated from Germany and built a prosperous life in America. His mother, Ella Friedman, was a talented artist who filled their Riverside Drive apartment with paintings and the soft light of creative aspiration. Young Robert, as he preferred to be called, grew up surrounded by original works by Picasso, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh, in an environment where intellectual curiosity was not just encouraged but expected. From his earliest years, Robert was different. While other children played with toys, he collected rocks with an intensity that bordered on obsession. By age 5, he had amassed a mineral collection that would have impressed professional geologists. By 12, he was corresponding with members of the New York Mineralogical Club, who had no idea they were exchanging sophisticated geological observations with a child. When they invited him to present a paper before the August Society, these distinguished scientists were shocked to find themselves face to face with a boy who hadn't yet reached his teenage years. This wasn't just precociousness. This was something else entirely. A mind that operated on a different plane from his peers, consuming knowledge with an appetite that seemed insatiable. But brilliance often comes with a price, and young Oppenheimer paid it in social isolation and physical frailty. He was thin, awkward, and frequently ill. A boy who found more comfort in books than in baseball, more fascination in Sanskrit poetry than in the rough-and-tumble world of boyhood adventures. His classmates at the Ethical Culture School in New York found him strange, too intense, too different. While they struggled with basic algebra, Robert was already exploring the elegant equations of calculus and devouring texts on classical architecture, French literature, and Eastern philosophy. He graduated high school at the top of his class, delivering his valedictorian speech in ancient Greek, a flourish that perfectly captured both his intellectual prowess and his complete disconnection from the normal concerns of adolescence. Harvard University beckoned, and Oppenheimer arrived in Cambridge in 1922, a young man of 18 carrying the weight of enormous expectations and his own crushing self-consciousness. Here, in the hallowed halls of America's most prestigious university, he would begin to find his true calling. Though the path would be neither straight nor easy, he attacked his studies with the same ferocious intensity he had brought to his childhood mineral collection, taking far more courses than any reasonable person would attempt. He wanted to learn everything, to master not just physics and chemistry, but literature, philosophy, and languages. He studied under the legendary Percy Bridgman, who would later win the Nobel Prize, and absorbed experimental physics with the same voracious appetite he brought to poetry and Sanskrit. Yet even at Harvard, Oppenheimer remained an outsider, a brilliant mind trapped in a body and personality that seemed constantly at war with themselves. He suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression, periods of darkness where the weight of existence itself seemed almost unbearable. He wrote letters home filled with existential angst, questioning the meaning of life, wrestling with feelings of inadequacy despite his obvious intellectual superiority. There were episodes that frightened his family, Moments where the line between genius and madness seemed disturbingly thin. During one particularly dark period, he left a poisoned apple on the desk of his tutor at Cambridge, an act that shocked everyone who learned of it and hinted at the psychological turbulence roiling beneath his cerebral exterior. Despite these struggles, or perhaps because of them, Oppenheimer completed his undergraduate degree in just 3 years, graduating summa cum laude in 1925, but he knew that his true education was just beginning. The frontiers of physics were exploding with revolutionary new ideas, and the real action was happening in Europe, where giants like Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Max Born were unraveling the bizarre and beautiful mysteries of quantum mechanics. Oppenheimer needed to be there, needed to sit at the feet of these masters and learn the new language that would describe the fundamental nature of reality itself. He sailed for Cambridge, England, to work at the legendary Cavendish Laboratory under J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. But experimental physics proved to be Oppenheimer's Achilles heel. His hands, so elegant when wielding a pen or turning the pages of a book, became clumsy and uncertain when manipulating laboratory equipment. He was terrible at it, and more importantly, he hated it. The precise, painstaking work of experimental science felt like torture to a mind that wanted to soar through the abstract realms of theory. He was miserable, depressed, and once again feeling like a failure despite his obvious brilliance. The darkness that had haunted him at Harvard returned with a vengeance, and there were genuine concerns for his mental stability. Salvation came in the form of a transfer to Göttingen, Germany, where Max Born was building one of the world's premier centers for theoretical physics. Here, finally, Oppenheimer found his true home. Theory was where his mind could truly shine, where his gift for abstract thinking and mathematical elegance could flourish without the constraints of experimental apparatus. Under Born's guidance, he blossomed, producing paper after paper on quantum mechanics, making significant contributions to the understanding of molecular structure and quantum tunneling. He was surrounded by the greatest minds in physics: Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, and he held his own in discussions with these giants. When he received his doctorate in 1927 at the age of 23, he had already published 16 papers and established himself as one of the most promising theoretical physicists of his generation. But Oppenheimer wanted more than just to be another physicist. He wanted to bring the revolution in physics back to America. In the 1920s, American physics lagged behind Europe, particularly in the esoteric realm of quantum mechanics. Oppenheimer saw an opportunity to change that, to build an American school of theoretical physics that could rival the great European centers. He accepted joint appointments at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena and the University of California, Berkeley, a decision that would shape not just his career but the entire landscape of American physics. In Berkeley, Oppenheimer transformed himself from a brilliant but socially awkward young scholar into a charismatic teacher who inspired devotion bordering on worship from his students. He created what became known as the Opie School, a group of brilliant young physicists who absorbed not just his scientific knowledge, but his entire aesthetic approach to physics and life. They imitated his mannerisms, the way he smoked cigarettes, the way he spoke in elegant, elusive phrases that wove together physics, poetry, and philosophy. They followed him from Berkeley to Caltech and back again, creating an intellectual community that attracted the best and brightest students in America. Under his guidance, Berkeley became a world center for theoretical physics, rivaling anything Europe had to offer. But Oppenheimer was more than just a teacher. He was making significant contributions to our understanding of the universe itself. He worked on problems at the cutting edge of physics, exploring the behavior of electrons and positrons, investigating cosmic rays, and pushing into the mysterious realm of what happens when massive stars collapse. In 1939, working with his student Hartland Snyder, Oppenheimer published a paper that, though largely ignored at the time, would later be recognized as the first theoretical description of what we now call black holes. He was describing objects so dense that not even light could escape their gravitational pull, predictions so bizarre that it would take decades before astronomers found evidence that such things actually existed in the universe. Yet, even as Oppenheimer built his reputation as one of America's leading theoretical physicists, storm clouds were gathering over the world. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and his Nazi regime was driving Jewish scientists into exile. Many of these refugees made their way to America, bringing with them not just their brilliance, but also terrifying news about German physics research. In 1938, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strussmann discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of the uranium atom, releasing tremendous amounts of energy. Within months, physicists around the world recognized the implications. A chain reaction of splitting atoms could release energy on a scale that dwarfed anything previously imagined. It could power cities or destroy them. Oppenheimer, who had always seemed somewhat detached from political realities, found himself increasingly drawn into the urgent conversations about what this new physics might mean for the world. The question haunting every physicist was simple and terrible. Could the Nazis build an atomic bomb? If Hitler's scientists succeeded in harnessing nuclear fission for military purposes, the war that had begun in September 1939 could end with Nazi Germany wielding a weapon of unimaginable power. The stakes could not have been higher, and the American government, initially slow to recognize the danger, was beginning to wake up to the possibility that physics had suddenly become as important to national security as any number of battleships or aircraft carriers. In 1941, everything changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought America fully into World War II, and suddenly the theoretical discussions about atomic weapons took on desperate urgency. The American government had already begun preliminary research into nuclear fission, but the effort was scattered, poorly coordinated, and moving far too slowly for the stakes involved. President Franklin Roosevelt, urged on by scientists including Albert Einstein, had authorized funding for atomic research. But what was needed was something far more ambitious, a massive, coordinated effort to build an atomic bomb before the Germans did. The U.S. Army took control of the project in September 1942, and General Leslie Groves was put in charge of what would become known as the Manhattan Project. Groves was a military engineer who had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon, a man who got things done through force of will and organizational brilliance. But he knew that building an atomic bomb would require more than just construction expertise. It would require scientific genius of the highest order. He needed someone to serve as the scientific director of the project, someone who could coordinate the work of the greatest minds in physics, someone who understood both the theoretical complexities and the practical requirements of turning theory into reality. He needed someone who could inspire and lead scientists who were used to working independently, someone who could see the big picture while also understanding the crucial details. In short, he needed Robert Oppenheimer. On paper, Oppenheimer was an unlikely choice for such a crucial role. He had never managed a large project. He had no Nobel Prize to his name, unlike many of the scientists he would need to lead. He had no experience with military matters or large-scale industrial coordination. His left-wing political associations, including close relationships with Communist Party members, made him a security risk in the eyes of Army intelligence. His brother Frank was a Communist Party member. His girlfriend Jean Tatlock was a communist, and his wife Kitty had been married to a communist who died fighting in the Spanish Civil War. By all conventional wisdom, Oppenheimer should have been disqualified from any sensitive military work. But General Groves saw something in Oppenheimer that others missed. When they met in October 1942, Groves was immediately impressed by Oppenheimer's grasp of the entire problem, not just the theoretical physics, but also the engineering challenges, the industrial requirements, and the organizational complexity of what needed to be done. Oppenheimer understood that building an atomic bomb wasn't just a physics problem. It was a problem of coordination, of bringing together different disciplines, of creating an environment where brilliant individuals could work together toward a common goal. He had a vision for how it could be done, and he conveyed that vision with a clarity and intensity that convinced Groves he had found his man. There was something else too, something harder to quantify, but perhaps even more important. Groves saw in Oppenheimer a man who wanted this responsibility, who understood the terrible weight of what they were trying to do and was willing to bear it. Oppenheimer knew that if they succeeded, they would be creating something that could kill hundreds of thousands of people in an instant. He knew the moral implications, the way this weapon would change warfare and perhaps human civilization itself. And yet he believed it had to be done, that the alternative, Hitler acquiring atomic weapons first, was unthinkable. Groves saw in Oppenheimer a man who would not shrink from the burden of knowledge and power. And that was exactly what this project needed. In November 1942, Oppenheimer was officially appointed as the director of the laboratory that would design and build the atomic bomb. His first task was to choose a location for this laboratory, somewhere remote enough to maintain secrecy, somewhere with enough space to build the facilities needed for such an ambitious project, somewhere that could attract and house the hundreds of scientists and their families who would need to work in complete isolation for the duration of the war. Oppenheimer knew exactly where it should be. As a young man, recovering from one of his periods of depression, he had spent summers in the mountains of New Mexico, riding horses through the vast, beautiful landscape of mesas and canyons. He had fallen in love with the stark beauty of the high desert, with a place called Los Alamos, a boys' school sitting on a mesa about 35 miles northwest of Santa Fe. It was perfect, remote, beautiful, with enough flat land to build a significant facility, and possessing the kind of austere grandeur that Oppenheimer found spiritually renewing. The decision was made, and throughout late 1942 and early 1943, construction began on what would become the Los Alamos Laboratory. What had been a quiet boys' school was transformed into a secret city, a place that would not appear on any map, where mail would be censored, where everyone would live behind fences with armed guards, where some of the greatest minds in science would gather to attempt something that many thought was impossible. Oppenheimer threw himself into the task of recruitment with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He needed to convince the best physicists in America, and indeed from allied nations around the world, to leave their comfortable university positions, to uproot their families, to live in the middle of nowhere under military security, to work on a project he could barely describe due to secrecy restrictions. And somehow, incredibly, he succeeded. Oppenheimer's force of personality, his vision, his ability to make each scientist feel that their contribution was essential to the most important work of their lives, proved irresistible. Hans Bethe, who would later win the Nobel Prize, agreed to come and head the theoretical division. Richard Feynman, a brilliant young physicist, who would become one of the 20th century's most influential scientists, joined the project. Enrico Fermi, who had already won the Nobel Prize and had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in Chicago in December 1942, agreed to bring his expertise to Los Alamos. Edward Teller, Stanislav Ulam, Emilio Segri, and dozens of other brilliant minds answered Oppenheimer's call. By the spring of 1943, scientists and their families began arriving at Los Alamos, driving up the winding mountain road to find themselves in a strange new world. They moved into hastily constructed apartments and houses, dealt with mud that turned the roads impassable after every rain, lived with inadequate sewage systems and limited supplies, all while working on a project that consumed their every waking hour. For many of the scientists, particularly the younger ones, there was an excitement to it all, a sense of being part of something historic, of using their knowledge to help win the war against fascism. They worked incredibly long hours, tackled problems that had never been confronted before, and slowly, painfully, began to turn theoretical physics into practical engineering. Oppenheimer was everywhere, involved in everything. He attended meetings of every division, understood the work of every group, could discuss the finest details of nuclear physics with the theorists in the morning, and then turn to practical questions of bomb design with the engineers in the afternoon. He had transformed himself from a purely theoretical physicist into something else entirely. A leader, a coordinator, a man who could see how all the pieces fit together and could communicate that vision to others. Scientists who had been skeptical about his appointment found themselves won over by his intelligence, his dedication, and his remarkable ability to understand and synthesize complex information from multiple disciplines. But it wasn't just his intellectual abilities that made Oppenheimer indispensable. It was his human qualities as well. He remembered the names of scientists' children, inquired about their families, showed genuine concern for their well-being even as he pushed them to work harder and faster. When scientists disagreed, which happened frequently given the collection of strong personalities and brilliant egos assembled at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer had an uncanny ability to mediate, to find common ground, to redirect competitive energy into productive collaboration. He created a culture where different disciplines worked together, where theorists and experimentalists, physicists and chemists and engineers could communicate and cooperate in ways that were unprecedented. In scientific research, the technical challenges were enormous and multiplied with each passing month. There were two possible approaches to building an atomic bomb, and Los Alamos had to pursue both simultaneously because no one knew which would prove more practical. One approach used uranium-235, a rare isotope that had to be separated from the much more common uranium-238 through industrial processes that were being developed at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The other approach used plutonium-239, an entirely man-made element that was being produced in reactors at Hanford, Washington. Both materials could sustain a nuclear chain reaction, but each presented unique challenges in terms of how to actually construct a working weapon. The basic principle was brutally simple, yet devilishly difficult to implement. You needed to bring together a critical mass of fissile material fast enough that it would explode rather than simply melt or fizzle. If you brought the material together too slowly, the chain reaction would begin prematurely, and instead of a massive explosion, you would get what the scientists grimly called a fizzle, a weak release of energy that would scatter the expensive fissile material without producing the desired effect. The timing had to be absolutely precise, measured in microseconds, and achieving that precision with 1940s technology seemed almost impossibly difficult. For the uranium bomb, the design that emerged was relatively straightforward. A gun-type weapon where one piece of uranium would be fired at another piece at extremely high speed, creating a critical mass in the fraction of a second before the chain reaction could blow the weapon apart. This design, which they called Little Boy, seemed reliable enough that Oppenheimer and his team felt confident it would work without testing. But the plutonium bomb was another matter entirely. Plutonium, they discovered to their horror in 1944, had isotope contamination that made a gun-type design impossible. The material would begin reacting too quickly, causing a fizzle before a proper critical mass could be assembled. This crisis threatened to derail the entire project. An enormous industrial complex had been built to produce plutonium. Billions of dollars had been spent, and now it seemed that plutonium might be useless for making a bomb. Oppenheimer and his team had to find another solution, and they found it in one of the most brilliant and audacious pieces of physics engineering ever conceived: implosion. Instead of shooting one piece of plutonium at another, they would surround a sphere of plutonium with conventional explosives. When these explosives detonated simultaneously from all directions, they would compress the plutonium sphere to tremendous density, creating the critical mass needed for an explosion. The concept was elegant in theory, but nightmarishly difficult in practice. The explosives had to detonate with perfect simultaneity and symmetry, or the compression would be uneven and the weapon would fail. This meant solving problems in hydrodynamics, explosive engineering, and materials science that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1940s technology. It required the invention of new explosive lenses that could shape the force of detonation, new electronic systems that could trigger multiple explosive charges within microseconds of each other, and new diagnostic tools to measure what was happening in the millionths of a second before a weapon exploded. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as the technical challenges mounted and the pressure to produce results intensified, Oppenheimer remained the steady center of the Los Alamos universe. He worked himself to physical exhaustion, losing weight from his already thin frame, smoking incessantly, sleeping only a few hours each night. He attended meeting after meeting, reviewed report after report, made decision after decision. When problems seemed insurmountable, He found solutions, or found the people who could find solutions. When morale flagged under the weight of seemingly endless difficulties, he inspired and encouraged. When the work seemed too abstract, too removed from the actual war being fought on distant battlefields, he reminded everyone why their work mattered. What was at stake if they failed? The laboratory grew from a few dozen scientists to hundreds, then to thousands when support staff and technicians were included. Los Alamos became a strange, secret city where some of the world's most brilliant minds lived behind barbed wire, where Nobel laureates stood in line at the commissary next to young graduate students, where theoretical discussions about the fundamental nature of matter took place in the same buildings, where machinists were fabricating components for weapons of unprecedented destructive power. It was a place unlike anywhere else on Earth, and Oppenheimer was its undisputed intellectual and organizational leader, the one person who understood every aspect of the project and could hold the entire complex enterprise together in his mind. As 1944 turned into 1945, the pace of work intensified. The war in Europe was reaching its climax, with Allied forces pushing toward Germany from both east and west. But intelligence about the German atomic program remained murky and worrying. Was Hitler on the verge of developing his own atomic bomb? No one knew for certain, and that uncertainty drove Los Alamos to work even harder, to solve problems even faster. Oppenheimer, bearing the weight of the entire project on his shoulders, pushed himself and his team toward the finish line, even as the physical and emotional toll became increasingly visible. But despite the exhaustion, despite the doubts that occasionally surfaced, despite the terrible knowledge of what they were creating, the work continued. The race to build the atomic bomb was entering its final, crucial phase, and Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who had never managed a laboratory, had become absolutely indispensable to America's war effort, the one person without whom the Manhattan Project might well have failed. By the spring of 1945, Los Alamos had become a pressure cooker of scientific ambition, technical challenges, and moral uncertainty. 3 years of intense work, billions of dollars, and the concentrated effort of thousands of people were converging toward a single moment, the test of the first atomic bomb. But even as that moment approached, the world situation was shifting in ways that complicated the moral calculus everyone at Los Alamos had been living with since the project's inception. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The enemy, whose atomic ambitions had sparked the frantic race to build the bomb first, was defeated. Hitler was dead, Germany was in ruins, and intelligence teams sent to investigate German nuclear facilities discovered that the Nazi atomic program had never come close to building a working weapon. This revelation sent shockwaves through the Los Alamos community. For many scientists, particularly those who had fled Nazi persecution in Europe, the primary motivation had been to ensure that Hitler did not acquire atomic weapons first. Now that motivation was gone. Yet the project continued with undiminished intensity. The target had shifted to Japan, which was still fighting fiercely despite suffering devastating conventional bombing campaigns and naval blockades. But Japan did not have an atomic weapons program, had never posed the same existential threat that Nazi Germany represented. Some scientists began to question whether the bomb should be used at all, or if it should be demonstrated to the Japanese in an unpopulated area rather than dropped on a city. Oppenheimer found himself at the center of these moral debates, though he remained committed to completing the weapon and making it available for military use. He chaired the scientific advisory panel to the interim committee, which was established by President Harry Truman to make recommendations about how the atomic bomb should be used. In June 1945, this panel considered the question of whether the bomb should be demonstrated rather than used directly on Japan. After careful deliberation, Oppenheimer and his fellow scientists concluded that they could not propose a technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. They could not guarantee that a demonstration would work, could not be certain that the Japanese military leadership would be impressed enough to surrender, and they knew that the United States had only a few bombs available. The recommendation was that the bomb should be used against Japan without prior warning, targeting military facilities, surrounded by worker housing to maximize the psychological and military impact. This decision, this recommendation, would haunt Oppenheimer for the rest of his life. But in the spring and summer of 1945, with the war still raging and American casualties mounting in the Pacific Theater, the pressure to end the conflict as quickly as possible overwhelmed other considerations. Oppenheimer and his team focused their energies on making certain that when the moment came, the weapons would work. The uranium gun-type bomb, little boy, required no testing. The design was straightforward, enough that everyone was confident it would function as intended. But the plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, was so complex and so novel that it absolutely had to be tested before it could be used in combat. The test site chosen was the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of Death, a desolate stretch of desert in southern New Mexico, about 200 miles south of Los Alamos. It was some of the most barren, inhospitable land in America, a place where the summer heat was brutal and the landscape was stripped down to rock and sand and the occasional hardy desert plant. In the middle of this wasteland, scientists and engineers built what they called Ground Zero, a 100-foot steel tower that would hold the test bomb. They prepared observation bunkers at various distances, set up instrumentation to measure the explosion, and made plans to evacuate nearby communities if radiation levels became dangerous. The test was code-named Trinity, a name Oppenheimer had chosen from a John Donne poem, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. It was a typically literate reference from a man whose mind ranged across physics, poetry, philosophy, and Sanskrit scripture with equal facility. But it also hinted at Oppenheimer's growing awareness of the spiritual and moral dimensions of what they were attempting. They were not just testing a weapon. They were birthing a new kind of power into the world, something that would forever change the relationship between humanity and the forces of nature. As July 1945 wore on and the test date approached, tension at Los Alamos reached almost unbearable levels. Everything hinged on Trinity. If the test failed, years of work would be called into question, and the entire plutonium production effort would be wasted. If it succeeded, they would have proven that atomic weapons were possible, but they would also have confirmed their ability to unleash destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. Scientists who had worked with absolute focus for 3 years now found themselves anxious, unable to sleep, worried about the countless things that could go wrong. Oppenheimer himself was gaunt, chain-smoking constantly, surviving on nervous energy and willpower. The bomb itself, assembled in the final days before the test, was a sphere of plutonium surrounded by precisely shaped explosive lenses, all encased in a bulky metal shell covered in cables and detonators. It looked nothing like the sleek, streamlined weapons that would appear in later decades. This was a prototype, crude and ungainly, but containing within its intricate innards the potential to release energy, equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. From a mass of plutonium smaller than a baseball, the scientists took final measurements, checked and rechecked every connection, every circuit, every detonator. There was no room for error, no possibility of a second chance if something went wrong. The test was scheduled for July 16, 1945, in the early morning hours before dawn. As the date approached, Oppenheimer barely slept, spending his time reviewing calculations, checking on preparations, dealing with the countless details that needed his attention. The night before Trinity, a severe thunderstorm moved across the test site, bringing lightning, wind, and driving rain that threatened to delay the test. Oppenheimer and General Groves debated whether to postpone, weighing the danger of lightning strikes against the pressure to proceed. President Truman was in Potsdam, Germany, meeting with Churchill and Stalin, and everyone wanted him to have knowledge of a successful test before crucial negotiations about the post-war world order. Finally, the weather broke, and the decision was made to proceed with a 5:30 a.m. detonation. Scientists and observers gathered at bunkers located at various distances from Ground Zero. Some were 10 miles away, some were 20 miles distant, all prepared with dark welding glass to protect their eyes from the expected intense flash of light. They had calculations suggesting what the blast would be like, but no one knew for certain. Some scientists had wagered on the size of the explosion. with estimates ranging from zero, a complete dud, to something powerful enough to ignite the Earth's atmosphere and destroy all life on the planet. That latter possibility had been carefully analyzed and dismissed as virtually impossible, but the mere fact that serious scientists had felt the need to calculate whether their test might end the world spoke to the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. Oppenheimer waited at the control bunker, 10,000 yards from ground zero. He was exhausted, his nerves stretched to the breaking point by years of pressure and weeks of final preparation. Everything he had worked for, everything that thousands of people had dedicated themselves to for 3 years, would be resolved in the next few minutes. Either the bomb would work, vindicating the enormous investment of money, talent, and time, or it would fail, possibly ending his career and calling into question whether atomic weapons were even possible with current technology. The countdown began, and Oppenheimer gripped a wooden post to steady himself, his eyes fixed on the tower barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At precisely 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m. Mountain War Time on July 16, 1945, the world changed forever. The plutonium core of the Trinity device was compressed to critical density by the simultaneous detonation of its explosive lenses, and for a fraction of a second, human beings created the conditions that normally exist only in the hearts of stars. The nuclear chain reaction released energy equivalent to approximately 22,000 tons of TNT, a blast more powerful than any explosion in human history. The flash of light was visible nearly 200 miles away. The heat was so intense that the desert sand directly beneath the explosion was fused into a greenish glass that scientists would later call trinitite. A mushroom cloud rose 7.5 miles into the atmosphere, an eerie, beautiful, and terrifying column of dust and debris illuminated by the still dark sky. In the observation bunkers, men reacted in different ways to what they witnessed. Some cheered, releasing the tension of years of work in exultant celebration. Some were simply stunned, unable to process what they had just seen. Some were frightened, suddenly confronting the reality of the destructive power they had created. Oppenheimer, watching the brilliant light bloom across the desert, later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita flashed through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was a moment of terrible clarity, recognition that he and his colleagues had irrevocably changed human history, had given humanity the power to annihilate itself. When the shockwave arrived, about 40 seconds after the flash, it knocked observers off their feet even at a distance of 10 miles. The sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. At the base camp, scientists embraced each other, some weeping with relief and exultation, others with a darker emotion that was harder to name. General Groves, the military man who had driven the project forward with relentless determination, shook Oppenheimer's hand and said simply, "I am proud of you." Oppenheimer, his face drawn and exhausted, replied, "Now we are all sons of bitches." It was a crude statement, but it captured something essential about the moral transformation that had occurred. They had set out to build a weapon to defeat fascism, and they had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. But in succeeding, they had created something that transcended any particular war or conflict, something that would define the human condition for generations to come. The scientists who drove back to Los Alamos that morning were not quite the same people who had driven out to the test site the night before. They had witnessed the birth of the atomic age, and they would spend the rest of their lives grappling with what that meant. The news of Trinity's success was transmitted to President Truman at Potsdam, where he was negotiating with Stalin over the shape of the post-war world. Armed with knowledge that America possessed a working atomic bomb, Truman felt his bargaining position strengthened considerably. Churchill noted that Truman seemed transformed after receiving the news, more confident and assertive in his dealings with the Soviet leader. The existence of the atomic bomb was mentioned to Stalin, though not in detail, and Stalin's apparent lack of surprise suggested that Soviet intelligence had already penetrated the Manhattan Project's secrecy. The atomic bomb was already becoming a factor in geopolitics. even before it had been used in combat. At Los Alamos, there was no time to rest on the success of Trinity. The war was still on, and now the focus shifted to preparing actual combat weapons. The uranium bomb, Little Boy, was shipped to the Pacific island of Tinian, where B-29 bombers were stationed within range of Japan. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, followed shortly after, a production model based on the Trinity design. The target selection committee had chosen several Japanese cities that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing raids so that the effects of the atomic bomb could be clearly observed. Hiroshima, a city of industrial and military significance, topped the list. As these preparations unfolded, Oppenheimer remained at Los Alamos, having poured everything he had into the project and now waiting to see how his creation would be used. He knew that an atomic bomb would be dropped on Japan. He had participated in the recommendations that led to that decision. He knew approximately how many people would die. The calculations had been done with grim precision. Yet knowing these things in the abstract was different from confronting the reality. And as the days passed, Oppenheimer seemed increasingly withdrawn, troubled by thoughts he could not fully articulate even to himself. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian carrying Little Boy. The flight to Hiroshima took about 6 hours, and at 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb bay doors opened and Little Boy fell away from the aircraft. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of about 1,900 feet above the city center, the bomb detonated. The uranium-235 critical mass was achieved exactly as designed, and approximately 1 kilogram of matter was converted into energy according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. The explosion, equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT, instantly killed tens of thousands of people. The heat, flash V,